The forest was black and endless, branches clawing at the sky while the ground pulsed with the sound of something moving unseen. Daniel woke with his heart slamming, the faint orange glow of his dying campfire breathing shadows across the trunks. The night was heavy, colder than before, and with it came a sound that cut through his half-dream like teeth breaking bone. He sat up fast, clutching his sleeping bag around his chest, whispering to himself, "I heard it. I swear I heard it." The growl came again, deep and ragged, too heavy to be a wolf and too near to be ignored. Leaves trembled, the fire cracked, and the forest hushed as if waiting. Daniel's throat was dry, his breath loud, betraying him to the thing outside the circle of firelight. He tried to steady himself, but his hands shook so violently that the flashlight nearly slipped away. He flicked it on, the weak beam cutting into the dark, revealing only trees, just trees. "Still," he whispered. "Stay back. Please." The air felt alive, crawling across his skin, and then the growl split the night again, closer this time, vibrating the soil under his knees. He knew he wasn't alone. Daniel forced himself to breathe slowly, though every sound in the forest pressed against him like a hand over his mouth. His mind raced with excuses. A bear, a wolf, anything natural, anything safe. Yet deep down he knew this was not the sound of an animal he'd ever heard. He remembered old stories his father told him about creatures that lived in these woods, things with voices that could freeze your blood before you even saw them. He shook his head, whispering, "No, no, it's just nerves." His fingers tightened around the flashlight, but the beam wavered as if the dark itself wanted to swallow it whole. Something moved between the trees. Daniel heard leaves crunch where no one should be walking. The growl came again, lower, longer, as if testing his fear. Daniel bit his lip hard, tasting blood, praying the sound would fade, but instead it circled him, first from the left, then the right, always just out of sight. He whispered, "Please leave me alone." The forest seemed alive, watching, listening, waiting. Daniel thought of his car parked 2 miles back down the dirt trail, so close yet unreachable in the suffocating dark. He considered running, but the thought of stepping into that blackness without light twisted his stomach into knots. He stayed frozen, firelight trembling, knowing something out there wanted him to move. Daniel thought of the skeptic back home, his friend Marcus, who laughed when he mentioned camping alone in haunted woods. He remembered Marcus saying, "You'll just scare yourself with shadows." Daniel clenched his jaw now, realizing how wrong those words were. The forest wasn't shadows, it was something worse. The fire popped, sparks rising, and in that split second of light, Daniel swore he saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the dark. His chest tightened, his skin prickled, and he whispered, "I see you." The eyes vanished, swallowed by night, but the growl that followed was closer than ever. The night pressed heavier, the fire almost dead. Daniel knew he had to decide: stay in the fragile glow of the camp or plunge into the woods to escape. The growl rumbled again, shaking the leaves, vibrating deep into his bones. He whispered his father's words like a prayer, "Never turn your back on what you fear." Slowly, with trembling hands, Daniel lifted his pack and readied himself. His heartbeat thundered louder than the night, and he realized the creature was waiting for him to make a move. Morning did not feel like safety so much as a thinner mask over the same fear. The forest had gone quiet by dawn, leaving Daniel with the memory of that growl lodged like a shard in his ribs. He kicked dirt over the dead fire and forced himself to walk the trail out. Each footfall sounded too loud, as if the trees might answer. He kept replaying the instant when he thought he saw eyes. He told himself he was exhausted, hungry, open to suggestions made by shadows. He whispered, "I need proof, or I need to forget." The path curved along a ravine, and he saw impressions in the mud larger than any boot. He crouched and touched the edges. The print was deep, splayed, and wrong. Daniel said, "I didn't imagine you." Wind moved high in the canopy and nowhere else. A distant knock echoed, like wood on wood, hollow and deliberate. He stood frozen, counting to 5, then counting again. A second knock answered from farther off, slower, patient. He backed away, breathing through his nose, and fought the urge to run. The trailhead felt too far to reach. He needed someone who could tell him what this meant, and what it did not. He needed a voice that would not laugh. Daniel drove into town with the windows down, trying to shake the smell of smoke and wet pine from his clothes. The diner's bell chimed too cheerfully when he stepped inside. Marcus sat at the counter with a grin that faltered when he saw the mud on Daniel's sleeves. Daniel said, "I heard it again." Marcus sipped coffee and tried a joke that died halfway through. He said, "Coyotes can sound like demons." Daniel laid his phone on the counter and scrolled through photos of the print. Marcus leaned closer, his face tightening despite himself. He said, "Big boot, odd angle." Daniel shook his head and told him about the knocks. Marcus said, "Trees fall. Echoes lie." Daniel stared at the metal napkin holder until his reflection steadied. He said, "Come with me tonight." Marcus looked at the window where gray clouds bunched over the ridge. He said, "You want a witness or company?" Daniel answered, "Both." The waitress set a plate down that he could not taste. The bell chimed again, and a pair of hunters walked in without meeting anyone's eyes. The room practiced the skill of not listening. After lunch, they crossed Main Street to a hardware shop where the bells sounded like a warning. The owner, Eleanor, watched them from behind a glass case of knives and bear bells. She had eyes like winter roads and patience that felt practiced. Daniel asked for plaster and measuring tape, then lowered his voice. He said, "Do you know anyone who's heard knocking in the back country?" Eleanor wiped the counter and chose not to answer first. She said, "What you cast you carry home." Daniel nodded and told her about the ravine. Marcus shifted, uncomfortable with the hush that fell. Eleanor said, "You two ought to be gone before dark." Marcus said, "We will be." Daniel said, "We won't." She looked between them as if weighing their worth against something older. From a drawer she took a faded map and marked a ridge with a dull pencil. She said, "If you hear 3 knocks, do not knock back." The shop clock ticked in uneven beats. Daniel tucked the map into his jacket and thanked her. Eleanor said, "Some answers make their own cost." They drove to the ridge before sunset to cast the print. The sky bled thin light through torn clouds, and wind combed the grass flat. Daniel mixed plaster with river water and poured carefully, while Marcus kept watch with a borrowed flare gun he did not trust. Daniel said, "If this sets right, it will be the first real thing." Marcus said, "The first heavy thing to carry." A woodpecker hammered somewhere downslope, and both of them flinched. The plaster settled, bubbling like a small breath. Daniel timed it and tried not to look into the trees. He said, "Eleanor told us not to answer." Marcus said, "We aren't answering." From the cut of the ravine came one hollow knock, far away. They did not move, and the second knock arrived closer, slow and exact. Daniel whispered, "Please hold." Third never came, and somehow that felt worse. The plaster hardened with a faint crust that captured the wrongness of the splayed toes. Marcus said, "Let's go." Back at the motel, a heater rattled, and the curtains breathed with each truck that passed. Daniel cleaned mud from the cast with a toothbrush while Marcus watched videos of animal calls and tried to match the tone. None fit. Daniel said, "If you change your mind, I'll go alone." Marcus rubbed his temple and said, "I hate that you would." A message from an unknown number appeared on Daniel's phone with a photo of a torn fence and a smear that looked like rust but was not. The caption read, "Stay out of the timberline." Daniel asked, "Who sent this?" Marcus checked the motel lot through the curtain. He said, "People play games with fear." Daniel held the cast up to the lamp, and the shadow it threw on the wall looked like a hand that never belonged to a person. He placed it beside the bed and lay down without sleeping, counting the seconds between distant trucks and the silence after. They returned to the forest at dusk with the cast wrapped in towels, and the map folded to the ridge. The air held a metallic taste like a storm that refused to arrive. Daniel parked at the trailhead where the sign leaned, and the notices fluttered with old staples. He said, "We go to the ravine, and no farther." Marcus nodded and adjusted his headlamp with hands that wanted to pretend steadiness. The first mile passed, with only the slide of gravel and the scrape of branches across their sleeves. Daniel kept trying to catch the scent he remembered, something damp and sour, and when he found it, his stomach tightened. He said, "Do you smell that?" Marcus said, "Skunk or worse." They reached the bend where the trees pressed closer, and a single low hoot moved through the canopy, too heavy to belong to an owl. Daniel squeezed the map until the paper went soft. He said, "If we hear 3 knocks, we keep walking." Marcus said, "We do not answer." They found the ravine and the cast's empty mold, left in the mud like a negative of a threat. Daniel compared edges and measured stride. He marked distances with flagging tape and wrote numbers on his wrist. Marcus kept scanning tree lines, stopping when silence felt pointed. A soft click sounded behind them, followed by a breath that did not belong to wind. Marcus said, "Say it is a deer." Daniel said, "It is not a deer." A twig snapped and something exhaled slowly, aware of their fear. Daniel raised his phone and recorded the quiet, because the quiet had shape. He whispered, "This has intent." First knock came then, not from far but from the ridge above, so close it made the mud ripple in the cast's hollow. A second arrived lower, across the ravine, patient agreement. Daniel counted to 3, and did not finish. He held up a hand to Marcus, and they waited for the third that never came. They backed away along the trail, careful not to turn their backs. Marcus said, "We have enough to leave." Daniel said, "We have enough to ask the wrong questions." The trees changed pitch, as if a pressure moved among them. From the right came a soft shuffle, from the left a mirrored answer. Daniel knew they were being bracketed. He lifted the cast like a shield and realized how absurd that was. A shape passed between trunks, tall and deliberate, its outline breaking the pattern of limbs. Marcus saw it too and whispered a prayer he never used. Daniel said, "Do not run." The shape stopped, and the night folded around it, hiding everything but the sense of scale. The air filled with a deep hum that never reached sound, only bone. Daniel took one step backward and felt the trail widen beneath his boots, as if the forest wanted him gone. A distant scream rose from the valley, human or not, and snapped off mid-breath. They reached a switchback where the hill fell away into a tangle of blowdowns. Daniel pointed to a broken branch 12 feet up, stripped smooth as if by a hand. He photographed it, and felt the wrongness settle into proof. Marcus tugged his sleeve and said, "Listen." The forest had become a held breath. No insects. No creak. Only the sound of their hearts mistaking themselves for footsteps. A stone clicked against another, slow and measured. Daniel said, "It is communicating." Marcus said, "With what?" The answer came as a soft reply from behind them, 2 stones meeting twice and then waiting. Daniel felt a pull to imitate to prove he understood, but Eleanor's warning burned through. He lowered his hand and said, "We go." The path ahead opened like a decision. Behind them, the stones clicked once more, flat and final. At the trailhead, the lot stood empty except for their car and a ranger truck angled like a question. A figure stepped from the cab and closed the door without haste. Cole asked if they were the ones leaving tape on county land. Daniel said yes and held up the cast. Cole studied it with a blank calm that felt learned. He said, "Plenty of reasons not to be here after dark." Marcus said, "We were lost." Daniel said, "We were listening." Cole's eyes moved past them to the tree line, as if counting breaths. He said, "People hear things when they want to." Daniel asked if anyone had reported knocks. Cole smiled without warmth and handed back the cast. He said, "You boys drive safe." As they pulled onto the road, Daniel watched the mirror. The ranger truck idled a moment longer than it needed to, headlights touching the first trees like a warning or a promise. The radio crackled in the cab, and Cole never raised it to his mouth. Dawn scraped pale light across the motel lot, while rain freckled the hood of the car. Daniel stared at the plaster cast and felt its weight like a verdict. Marcus said, "We take it to someone who knows." Daniel nodded and checked the map Eleanor had marked. The pencil ridge looked like a scar the town refused to heal. They drove past shuttered storefronts and the diner's dark sign. At the library annex they found a local archive room that smelled like paper and wet wool. A clerk pointed them to a binder of clippings without asking questions. Daniel turned pages of missing pets, toppled trash cans, and a column about night knocks. Marcus said, "It's folklore with teeth." Daniel found a photo of a print from 20 years back that matched the splay and depth. The caption named Cole as the deputy on scene. Marcus said, "That is not nothing." Rain deepened against the windows, and the lights hummed like insects. Daniel traced the caption with one finger and felt the story double back on itself. He said he knew. They drove to the hardware store, and the bell rang like a warning they had already ignored. Eleanor watched them cross the floor with the cast wrapped in towels. Daniel set it on the counter and opened the binder photo. He said, "Cole was there years ago." Eleanor did not blink. She said, "Some jobs make you practice silence." Marcus said, "Why mark the ridge if you wanted us gone?" Eleanor sighed as if the question cost her. She drew a small circle beside the pencil ridge and said, "Old camps, older graves, older mistakes." Daniel asked whose mistakes. Eleanor looked past them to the door and said, "Families, leave chains in the ground and call it history." Daniel felt a cold thread pull through his chest. He said, "Are we part of that?" Eleanor's mouth thinned. She said, "You came back when it knocked." That is enough answer. Back at the motel, Daniel spread the map, the photo, and the cast on the bedspread like evidence in a trial no court would hold. Marcus paced between the window and the bathroom door. He said, "You want to confront Cole?" Daniel said, "I want the truth." Marcus hesitated and then unlocked his duffel. From a hidden pocket he pulled a memory card and a small trail camera. Daniel stared. Marcus said, "I said it last week near the ravine, after you first told me stories." Daniel swallowed anger that tasted like rust. He said, "You laughed at me while you hunted proof." Marcus said, "I laughed so you would not go alone." He pushed the card across the bed. Daniel slid it into his laptop with shaking hands. The first clips showed branches and rain. The fourth showed eyeshine high off the ground, then a tall shape stepping between trunks with measured grace. The timestamp matched the night of the growls. They watched the clip again with the volume turned high until a hollow knock bled through the tinny speakers. Daniel paused on a single frame where the shape's shoulder brushed a trunk and left bark stripped clean. Marcus said, "We have to give this to someone." Daniel said, "Cole will bury it." A message pinged his phone from the same unknown number as before. It read, "Stop casting graves." Attached was a photo of the plaster cracked in two, but their cast lay whole on the bed. Marcus said, "Someone was there before us." Daniel felt the room shrink. He said, "Or someone followed us back." Tires hissed on wet pavement outside, and a heavy engine idled. Marcus peeked through the curtain and cursed under his breath. The ranger truck sat in the lot with lights off and patients on. A knock came at the door, polite and wrong. Cole stood under the awning with rain pinning his cap to his head. He looked at the bed and at their faces and then at the cast. He said, "You picked up something that does not want company." Daniel said, "You have seen it before." Cole did not answer that question. He said, "Return what you took, and it will pass." Marcus said, "We did not steal." Cole's mouth became a straight line that felt like a gate shut. He said, "You do not understand the trade." Daniel took a step forward. He said, "Trade with who?" Cole looked past him at the curtain and the glass dark beyond. He said, "Not who." Then he left without turning his back, and the truck pulled away slow, headlights holding the door in their wash as if expecting it to open on its own. They drove to the ridge at night with the cast wrapped in a trash bag like contraband. Wind pushed low clouds over the moon, and the forest breathed in slow, damp lungs. Daniel said, "We return it where we found it." Marcus said, "And then we leave." The trails swallowed their flashlights and fed them back a dim corridor. At the ravine, Daniel knelt and set the cast in the mud, aligning it with the mold like closing a mouth. He said, "No more trade." A knock sounded far away, then another closer, the cadence patient and old. Marcus said, "Do not answer." Daniel held his breath until his chest burned. A third knock did not come. Instead, the trees leaned with a pressure that had nothing to do with wind. Something stepped once, heavy enough to ripple the puddles in circles that never reached edges. Daniel whispered to the dark, "We are leaving it." A low breath moved through the canopy like fabric torn underwater. Marcus raised the flare gun but kept it pointed at the ground. He said, "Say we go now." Daniel stood slowly and backed from the cast. The dark answered with a stone click to their right, then to their left, as if bracketing them again. Daniel said, "We are not here to talk." The shape stepped between trunks, taller than the limb scar they had photographed, and paused where the cast lay. It did not rush. It occupied space with the certainty of a storm. Marcus said, "Daniel." Daniel kept his eyes on the ground and counted backward from 10 die. The shape sniffed, a wet sound edged with cold iron. The knock stopped. The forest waited with it. The flare gun fired without a plan, Marcus flinching at his own fear, the red bloom tearing the dark open. The shape recoiled and then surged sideways, not away but around, quick as a thought. Daniel grabbed Marcus by the jacket and dragged him toward the switchback. Branches whipped their faces, and the path switched from dirt to slick rock. Behind them, the breath turned to a growl that held language in its bones. Daniel said, "Do not fall." Marcus stumbled and slammed a shoulder into a trunk. The flare hissed out, and the night sealed. They ran blind for 10 steps, and then the ground vanished. They slid down a wet chute of roots into a pocket of ferns that swallowed sound. Above, heavy footfalls paced the trail, measuring, deciding. Daniel pressed a palm over his mouth and counted the beats as if they could buy time. They crouched in the fern pocket while the footsteps slowed and a new sound entered, a second pacing presence that matched the first in weight. Daniel felt the math of danger double. He said, "There are 2. Marcus breathed through clenched teeth and nodded once. A rock clacked against another above, a message traded without haste. Daniel pulled the trail camera from Marcus's pack with careful hands. He set it facing the chute, the red sensor blinking like a stubborn heartbeat. Marcus whispered, "Why record what kills us?" Daniel said, "To remember how to leave." The foals retreated toward the ravine, and the forest let out a breath it had held for years. They crawled to the path and stood up into a silence that rang. Far off, the faintest 3 knocks finally fell, spaced like a sentence closing. They reached the trailhead breathless and raw, and the ranger truck waited with engine off and windows black. Cole stepped from the shadows as if he had been poured from them. He looked at the mud on their faces, and at the empty space where the cast should be. He said, "You brought it back." Daniel said, "We did." Cole nodded once. He said, "Then you can leave." Marcus said, "There are 2. Cole's jaw worked before the answer came. He said, "There have always been 2 when they decide." Daniel asked what they had decided. Cole turned his head toward the trees and listened to a silence that felt spoken. He said, "They decided to count you and let you pass." Daniel understood the cost of that mercy. He said, "Who pays when the count changes?" Cole did not move. He said, "Everyone." Morning arrived without relief, and the highway unspooled beneath tired tires while Daniel counted fence posts like rosary beads. Marcus watched the mirror until the glass felt hypnotic and useless. The ridge shrank in the distance but clung to their thoughts like burrs. Daniel said, "If we leave now, it will own every mile anyway." Marcus said, "Then we choose the mile where it stops." They reached town to find the diner lights bright, and the bell too cheerful for what they carried. Newspapers on the counter spoke of weather and football, not knocks and shadows. Daniel showed the trail clip to the cook, who only shook his head and turned the volume down. Marcus said, "We are not built for this," and laughed without humor. Daniel felt the laughter scrape bone. He said, "We are built to remember." Outside, a freight train moaned, and the sound tunneled through their chests. Somewhere in that iron voice was a patience the forest also knew. They paid and left because staying felt like a lie that would grow teeth. They went to the library again because paper still felt heavier than rumors. Daniel spread maps and dates like a quiet storm across a table that listed under the weight of water stains. Marcus traced disappearances and found a rhythm that made sleep feel dishonest. He said, "Every 13 to 15 years, there is a cluster." Daniel said, "Old mistakes become tides." The clerk ignored them with a professional calm that smelled like restraint. On a microfilm screen, a headline blinked in negative light that hurt to read. Daniel whispered, "Cole's name is everywhere and nowhere." Marcus said, "He learned to stand to the side." Outside, rain thickened and erased distant shapes with soft hands. Daniel felt the urge to run and the need to stay collide like weather fronts. He said, "Eleanor knows more than she can carry alone." They copied nothing because copies felt like theft the woods might punish. They found Eleanor closing the hardware store early, and the bell gave a tired ring that felt like a ritual. Daniel said, "It counted us and let us pass." Eleanor locked the door and turned the sign with hands that did not shake. She said, "It counts because someone taught it to." Marcus said, "Who did that?" Eleanor looked at the floor as if the answer hid in dust. She said, "Families before mine and yours, trading quiet for safety." Daniel felt anger rise and then fail because anger belongs to smaller problems. He said, "Cole told us to return what we took." Eleanor nodded and said, "He keeps the peace that does not heal." Rain ratcheted against the awning and drew a map on the sidewalk. Marcus said, "We set a camera. It saw more than we wanted." Eleanor closed her eyes and said, "What you bring back will change how it stands." Daniel asked, "Against who?" She opened her eyes and said, "Against you, if you measure wrong." At the motel, Daniel and Marcus laid out gear as if building a language where fear could not interrupt. Batteries charged, timestamps aligned, and the cast's absence made the room feel less crowded and more haunted. Daniel said, "We give the footage to no one who files it away." Marcus said, "Then we become the filing cabinet." They reviewed frames until their eyes watered and edges bled into meaning. A frame showed bark torn high and fibers clinging like fur, caught on a nail made of tree. Daniel paused there and took a still. He said, "This is a kind of oath." Marcus said, "Or a debt note." Outside, a truck passed slow, and the wall hummed like a swallowed warning. Daniel packed the camera and folded the map until the ridgeline disappeared. He said, "We leave at first light and do not return." Marcus heard the hope in that sentence, and let it stay because some lies perform first aid. Before dawn, they loaded the car in a silence that worked like a pack. Fog clung to the lot and softened edges until the world looked undecided. Cole waited by the exit where the asphalt met gravel, neither blocking nor waving them on. Daniel rolled down the window and held the still photo out like a confession. Cole glanced at it, and then at their faces, and then past them to the trees. He said, "Some truths do not travel well." Marcus said, "We are not mailing it home." Cole said, "You do not have to. It will follow because it was counted with you." Daniel felt the air thin. He said, "What breaks the count?" Cole stepped back and said, "Staying breaks it worse than leaving." The gate of morning opened an inch, and the road pointed like a knife someone forgot to put away. They drove because advice feels like fate when the speaker never blinks. The highway lifted into hills and dropped into a town that did not know their names, which felt like mercy. Daniel booked a room with a view of a water tower that hummed in wind. Marcus opened the laptop and saved copies to drives, labeled with numbers instead of hope. Daniel said, "We say nothing until it matters." Marcus said, "It always matters and never helps." In the mirror, the plaster shadow was gone, yet the space it had claimed still tugged at the eye. A freight line ran behind the motel, and each passing car stitched a seam through their thoughts. Daniel texted Eleanor a single word that felt like a hand offered and a door closed. He wrote, left, and set the phone face down. The room smelled like detergent and old carpet, and a thin thread of rain that found every crack. Sleep came like a thief that forgot to take anything but left drawers open. They ate at a quiet place that served breakfast all day, because some comforts ignore clocks. Marcus scrolled headlines that would never print what mattered. Daniel said, "If no one listens, we still know." Marcus said, "Knowing is a room with one chair." A server filled their cups with a smile that never asked questions. Outside, wind moved plastic flags into a slow applause that felt sarcastic. Daniel remembered the eyeshine and the height and the careful way the shape stood. He said, "It did not hate us, it counted us." Marcus said, "Counting is colder than hate." Trucks whispered past, and their trailers rattled like old chains. Daniel watched the door and felt relief each time it opened on someone ordinary. He held that word in his mouth until it dissolved into something braver and smaller. Back at the room, the drives blinked in patient rhythm while the radiator clicked a tired code. Daniel opened the trail still and studied tree fiber caught in the torn bark. He said, "This is proof for people who already believe." Marcus said, "And bait for people who never will." A knock sounded on a neighboring door and made both of them flinch into old shapes. Daniel breathed out and laughed, and the laugh surprised him by not breaking. Marcus said, "We could post and let it eat us online instead of outside." Daniel shook his head and closed the laptop. He said, "We keep it until keeping costs more than leaving." The room settled around that sentence, as if furniture could approve. Across the lot, a train horn folded the sky and left a crease that would not smooth. Close to midnight, Daniel woke to a sound that was not a sound, but a weight on the air. The room felt 1 inch smaller and 1 degree colder. Marcus slept with one arm over his eyes and dreamed the kind of dream that leaves fingerprints. Daniel stood at the window and parted the blinds with 2 careful fingers. The parking lot lay empty except for their car and a shadow that refused geometry near the dumpster. He said, "It followed the number with us." The shadow shifted and resolved into the outline of stacked pallets that had learned how to wait. Daniel let the blinds close and leaned his forehead to the glass until it cooled him back into a body. He said, "Tomorrow we drive farther," and the words felt like a map that might or might not draw a road. Morning light thinned the night and made the room look innocent and used. Daniel packed methodically and left the key on the table where tiny scratches drew a map of other departures. Marcus stood by the door with the drives in a bag that felt heavier than plastic. A text arrived from an unknown number with a single audio file attached. Daniel pressed play and the speaker breathed out a hollow rhythm. Knock, pause, knock, long pause, knock. Marcus said, 3. Daniel said, "It did not ask us to answer, it asked us to remember the count." Outside, wind pushed a child's lost kite along the fence until it found a place to climb. They walked to the car and the drives blinked through canvas like eager eyes. Daniel started the engine and said, "We keep going until the number changes." The road opened, and the forest at their backs listened like a choir that never sings for strangers.